Geeks and geekettes, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, gats and kittens, senors and senoras, comic fans all around the world, welcome to your College of Knowledge, your inside man in the world of comics, comic books, where you get to ask me what I do for a living. What I do for a living is I write comic books, oddly enough. So before we get to our questions, got a little bit of breaking news. Now, I meant to record this last week, so this breaking news isn't quite as fresh as it might have been. But Warner Brothers, for a long time, has been in financial straits. And I would say creative straits, too. They're in the doldrums. They're in the horse latitudes of the entertainment industry, along with Paramount and Disney and just about everybody else. And they brought in a guy, David Zaslav, from Discovery, and I don't know how that deal worked. I don't know if Discovery bought Warner's or they merged. I don't know. But Zaslav did a heroic job of reducing Warner Brothers' debt. It was into the tens of billions, and he managed to reduce it down to just 10 billion. Still a whole lot of money. And the studio, heavy rumors, legitimately sourced that they were really counting on this Superman movie to show them the way theatrically. They were riding with James Gunn. They put all their eggs in his basket, and it underperformed. And not only did it underperform for a Superman movie. Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, they're bankable. They're bankable properties. But Superman did not really make them any money. And so they put it out there that they were up for grabs. And Netflix put forth an offer. They bought stock options, or they bought stock at $27.45 or something like that. Zaslav wanted $30 a share, but Netflix is like, no. And but Netflix outbid Skydance, which was also trying to buy Warner's. And for my own personal selfish reasons, I'm kind of glad Netflix got Warner's, because I really want Skydance to buy Paramount and save Star Trek. That's very selfish of me. Also considering that there's a whole lot of properties at Warner's that Netflix could potentially ruin. Now, in this deal, it was an $82 billion deal, but it was actually $72 in cash and stock buys, and Netflix will assume Warner Brothers $10 million in debt, which, they can get 100 new subscribers and wipe that off the books by Christmas. So what I'm hearing, the reason why Netflix wants this so bad is because, Warner's has a theatrical distribution machine. It's been in place for 100 years. And Netflix doesn't. Netflix does not have a way into movie theaters with wide releases. They when they do that, they generally rely on a partner, and they don't have to. They can just distribute through Warner's. And why is this important? Because everybody's saying, oh, the movie theater, that's going the way of the dinosaur and everything else. But for promotional purposes, it can beat a theatrical release. I know, everybody knows, there's tons of stuff that's streaming that most people have never heard of. It's very, very hard to promote a streaming show because there's so much noise on social media, on the internet, ads popping up on your phones and your devices. It's really hard to put forward what this new property that you have that you're streaming. But when a movie gets released, it has more coverage. More people are aware of what's at the movies than they are streaming. I mean, largely because it's a smaller venue, obviously. You can only release so many movies a week. But this allows Netflix to draw attention, because Netflix has made some really, huge, like what would have been tentpole blockbuster potentially blockbuster movies. They've spent hundreds of millions of dollars on things, and then no one watches them because no one's aware that they're on, or they find them later. There's no big opening weekend generally for something streaming, unless it's got a lot of wind behind it, or it's part of it's a new entry in a major franchise, which is like, I guess, what Disney counts on. But Netflix doesn't have any of that, and now they do. They've got Warner's. Now, will the deal go through? Because this is a big sale. This is a big merger. This is a big chunk of the entertainment industry, and particularly the streaming space, that's now going to be even more dominated by Netflix than it already was. Netflix is like 70% of the market. This could lift it to 80, maybe. Not right away, because obviously they're going to be able to add lots more content. Warner's has literally thousands of movies, TV shows, cartoons, all the rest of it, all these properties. And they'll be able to put as much of that or as little of that on Netflix as they care to. They'll absorb HBO Max. I assume they think that HBO Max subscribers will move over to them. Maybe there's a mechanism so HBO subscribers will simply become Netflix subscribers. I don't know how all that works. But just the added content is not going to get them any new subscribers. They're going to have to use that Warner's muscle at the box office to draw new eyes to their streaming service and new subscribers, because that's what it's all about. But will the deal go through? Because it's a big, big deal. And the government, our government, with its antitrust laws, anti-monopoly laws, will certainly have to review this and have something to say about it. And then it gets down to politics. So we'll see what happens. But for you and me, humble comic book fans, our question is, what happens to DC Comics now? Is Netflix going to finally shutter them and just license their properties out? Much like the Looney Tunes characters are being licensed out by Warner's. Are Netflix going to draw the Looney Tunes characters back in under the Warner umbrella? I don't know. I think the only thing protecting DC at the moment is they're such a tiny little part of this enormous entertainment conglomerate. Now they're an even tinier part because they're part of Netflix. So will it take some time for the auditors to get around to them and decide whether or not to shut them down as a publishing company? I don't know. I'm curious to see what happens. We all are, because our beloved DC comic book characters, we want to know their fate and who are they going to drop into the hands of. We didn't used to have to worry like this, did we? You didn't have to worry that James Bond was going to fall into the wrong hands, or Batman, or Spider-Man, or whoever. But now we do. I mean, every time I hear about a beloved character of my own who's now going to be a TV or a movie, my reaction is, oh no. Because we really want to have them preserved as the iconic characters they are. I don't mean frozen in time, but, keep the core, coolness, the core X factor of whatever made this character popular. Keep that, retain that, understand that. And they so seldom do. Anyway, if you have questions, suggestions, whatever, this isn't the end. I'm just putting this up front. I'm front loading this. BrunoBookstore@gmail.com. BrunoBookstore@gmail.com. Hey, I said that like Bill O'Reilly. Great War of Separation, Chapter 3 is up and running from Rippaverse. It's available now for pre-order through December 26th, Boxing Day. So don't wait for Boxing Day. If you want to find out how the Great War of Separation proceeds in its penultimate chapter, check it out. All right, questions. Everybody's got questions. Well, not everybody. The show would be hours and hours long. David Jordan, a Punisher story that really took advantage of just how grimy and terrible New York was in the 70s would be great. show the Bronx when there was half demolished buildings and one's literally falling apart that people still had to live in, vacant lots everywhere, etc. Yeah, 70s where the Punisher was born. Punisher was born basically, well, he was a knockoff of Mac Bolan, the Executioner, but more so, a child of movies like Dirty Harry and Death Wish, and this was entertainment that reflected the public frustration with the rise in crime rates and the occurrence of more and more violent crime, and cities becoming more and more dangerous and unlivable. And New York, certainly in the 70s, was teetering on unlivability. It was a dangerous place to go, and no more dangerous place than the South Bronx, which is basically a road warrior. How bad was it in the 70s? It was so bad. I used to go up to get, in vain to get try to get interviews at DC and Marvel. But I was also working in children's books at the time, so I was, pretty frequently traveling from my place outside of Philadelphia to New York, commuting by train, going in and visiting with the children's book publishers. This is like a once-a-month trip. And I remember getting off the train in Penn Station, and as you went to the escalators that took you up to the street level, there were uniformed New York police officers handing out a little paper pamphlet called Fear City. The police took it upon themselves to warn unsuspecting, hapless visitors that there are places in New York maybe you shouldn't go. And it had suggestions of how to keep yourself safe from being mugged, raped, whatever. And it had a map of places in New York City you shouldn't go during certain hours, and then others, don't ever go there. It's like, don't get off that subway at this stop, or nobody's ever going to see you again. And this was the police handing, because they were frustrated too. They were frustrated at the level of crime, and they had liberal mayors who wouldn't let them do what they needed to do to stop it. And the other thing is that large swaths of the city were abandoned. The South Bronx was mostly low-income public housing, what they call projects, and they had been abandoned because it became unlivable. There was no more running water. The windows were smashed out. The buildings were falling apart because of there was no one occupying them. And this is something that people don't seem to understand. That when you have a building and it's unoccupied, you think, oh, well, it's just unoccupied. It's like when you put, something in the freezer to eat later, it's going to be the same when you pull it out. Buildings aren't like that. If buildings aren't occupied, if they're not actual living human beings in there, they begin to fall apart because there's no one to notice that they are beginning to fall apart. There's no one to say, hey, we need some paint here, or we need some plaster, or there's been a leak and it's ruined the floors here. There's no one to say that. So buildings begin to fall apart. Now, very, very poor people were still living in these buildings, basically like they were in the Middle Ages. No electricity, no water, no phone service. Largely no public transportation coming to them. And they were living there. So you had junkies and drunks, just squatting in these places, and nobody cared. But you also had people that were desperately poor and had no choice. They just had to stay. And it was a really, really sad situation. And the thing is, a lot of these buildings were beginning to fall down, but then others had some help. Somewhere in the late 70s, gangs got a hold of dynamite at a construction site, and they began blowing the buildings down themselves. I don't think they were making a political statement. I think they were doing it for sport, just because they could. And they were blasting these buildings down. Billy Joel mentions it in a song. They blew the Bronx away. That literally was happening. And this is what New York City was like in the 70s. So yeah, a Punisher story set in that era. And actually, if you ever want to see the South Bronx as it was then, there's a film, Night of the Juggler. This is a practically forgotten action film. It came out in '79, starring James Brolin, and it's a crime action thriller. It's really worth seeing. This movie came and went. If you didn't catch it on HBO 1 month in 1980, you never got to see it. It was in and out of theaters so fast, everyone's head spun. The studio abandoned it, but then recently it's gotten a 4K restoration, and it's out, and it's available, it's affordable, and you can watch it. And it all takes place in New York City. It's all shot on location. And much of the movie takes place in South Bronx at its nadir. And when you watch it, your jaw's going to drop. Because you're like, this is New York City? It looks like Berlin in 1945. I mean, Mogadishu looks like a better place to live than the South Bronx was in the 70s. I mean, just block after block after block of rubble, buildings falling apart, abandoned cars, burnt abandoned cars, horrible. And the movie takes some pains to show you what living conditions were like in that period. But I recommend the movie anyway. It is a hell of a chase thriller, just action-packed with a great cast. Should have made James Brolin a huge star, but it was in and out of theater so quick. So yeah, Punisher, 1970s New York, bring it on. I mean, that's his environment. That is his war zone. That is what Punisher grew out of. And unfortunately, with the crime rates today in New York, they're kind of heading in the same direction. Everything's kind of falling apart for the city. It's so sad because I love New York. I really honestly love New York. Used to love visiting. And things just seem to be coming apart at the seams, and nobody seems to have any answers. More questions. Okay, here we go. Okay, this is a long one, folks, so hang with me. McCran Comics. He puts forth a lengthy statement, which is worth considering. And I didn't want to take anything away from it. I didn't want to edit it down. So these are his words. Superhero comics didn't used to shy away from real-life enemies, such as Nazis or Soviets, and to varying degrees, there have been other depictions of actual conflicts with Korea and Vietnam. Why is this not so with the threats such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS? Why has every war been on the table except the war on terror? In fact, I'd say there was virtually no meaningful reaction to 9/11 whatsoever. I don't recall DC really addressing it beyond that Alex Ross illustration of Superman admiring first responders, and Marvel did a comic that I would consider to be in poor taste, depicting the heroes impotently watching the surprise attack on the World Trade Center, and though joining the rescue effort, make no attempt to track down those responsible, compounding their prior failure to prevent the whole thing. He continues, further still, there was almost an opposite reaction. Both companies, but especially Marvel, have since bent over backwards to introduce Muslim superheroes like Ms. Marvel, Kamala Khan, and other Muslim characters, and generally depict Islam as a wonderful thing. And the only time I can recall terrorists, I don't think they were explicitly specified to be Muslim, and Captain America was depicted as sympathizing and giving credence to their point of view. I think it's one thing to remind everyone of nuance, and another to have an embodiment of our country concede that there was a valid point to slaughtering innocents. It's one thing to show the world outside your window, and another to introduce a new guardian of New York City who promotes the same religion that altered the skyline outside your window. Obviously, he continues, obviously we shouldn't write off an entire population as villains, and obviously we couldn't disrespect the efforts of real-life people by depicting fictional characters handily defeating individuals we know did not actually meet this fictional fate. And your mileage may vary, but it also seems obvious to me not to pretend that 9/11 never happened. But how should we have handled it? How can we handle it now, so many years later? Can it even be touched anymore? Hypothetically, how would you handle it in current day, if at all, given the opportunity with Cap or Superman or whatever original equivalent. That is all very, very well stated. Yes, 9/11 was addressed by the comic book companies in as passive a way as possible. A far cry from Batman and Robin, gunning down Japanese, and Captain America going after Nazis, and Submariner in the 50s sinking submarines full of Russians. This passive, and the Marvel comic was embarrassing. It was embarrassing. DC did one, and I wasn't asked to be a part of it because they knew better. And Muslims were off limits. It's weird because if you remember 9/11, if you're old enough to remember that day, and if you are, you remember that entire morning. You remember everywhere you were, everything you were doing. There was, 9/11 and the days following, there was this, everybody's flying the American flag. There was unity, USA, USA, and everybody was, hooray for us, and let's go get them. To the extent that a very, I have a friend, very, very liberal guy, very, very liberal. We don't agree on anything. We really like each other, and we're friends, and, we like the same, comics and movies and stuff like that. This guy that introduced me to South Park. But, we don't agree on anything politically. Nothing. And after the second tower came down, my phone rang. And I answered it, and it was him. And I didn't even get a chance to say hello. He just started screaming, nuke them. Screaming. This guy was, calm as can be, cool as ice all the time. Screaming, nuke them. We have to nuke them. We have to kill them all. Now, this is a liberal. This is a guy that, at the time, he had voted for Bill Clinton. He had voted for Al Gore. Like I said, we didn't agree on anything. But now, all of a sudden, he was to the right of me. He was over there with Genghis Khan on the political spectrum. Just killed them all. And largely, that was the attitude in the few days following 9/11. And I remember the very next day reading articles about how this was the end of irony, that we were going to start taking things more seriously. And we were going to, be aggressive in taking care of this. And this unity was going to last. And it wasn't hard to imagine that would be true. We lost 3,000 Americans in one day. And remember, if you remember that day, none of us knew if this was the beginning of something or the end of something. Were these attacks just the start of a continuing campaign? Were we going to see more of these atrocities the following day or the next week or a month later? We didn't know. We didn't know anything. And was this the beginning of some sort of, war? From who knows who? And we weren't wrong in thinking that. I mean, certainly Pearl Harbor was the beginning of attacks on the United States. And it was the beginning of a world war. Was this the beginning? And were we safe? I mean, people were fearful. I went and picked up my youngest from school. I didn't want him at school. I wanted him home. And I think a lot of parents did that. A lot of parents were picking up their kids. So remember, and so I remember reading these articles about how we're all together in unity and flying the flag and all the rest of it. And talking about it with my wife. And my wife said, 2 weeks from now, we'll be back to normal. The politicians will all be attacking each other again. And people will be questioning our role in the world and everything else. And I said, no, this time it's different. Well, she was right, as she often is. As she almost always is. She was right. She's a keener student of human nature than certainly I am. And certainly most people that I know. And she said, no, we'll be back to fighting each other and arguing. And she was right. And all of a sudden, within a few days, we've got Islamophobia. It's a word we never heard of. They just made it up. Islam, unreasonable fear of Muslims. This is in the days following when Muslim radicals killed thousands of innocent Americans. I don't think our fear was unreasonable if we had it. And the media and our government were warning against people retaliating, going over to the falafel shop and killing everybody inside because they looked like terrorists. And the media was and still to this day predicts this is a danger. This is something that could happen. That like the rednecks in Night of the Living Dead, everybody would arm up and jump in their pickup trucks. White people, of course, because white people are always the bad guys in the eyes of the media and the government, and just willy-nilly blowing away anybody who looked even slightly Middle Eastern. And and I know that didn't happen. And and I know it'll probably never happen. We all had people in our lives, whether we knew them intimately or associated with them casually, who were Muslim. Doctors. I have Muslim doctors. The guy at the convenience store, for a stereotype. People that you run into, and now you're certainly aware, you're more aware that they're Muslim, or are they Muslim, or are they Indian, Hindu? You don't know. We don't know. We're Americans. We don't have a lot of distinctions. But you may have just been aware of it, but you weren't thinking, I want to kill that guy. I lived in a pretty rural part of Pennsylvania. Guns everywhere. And our local convenience store, independently owned, was run by a couple of guys from Egypt. And still went down there, still got your morning coffee, still ran down there if you ran out of ketchup late on a Sunday night, it's the only place around to get anything. And I never heard word one. And my neighbor at the time worked in government. He worked in what would become the Department of Homeland Security. And I never heard anything from him. Hey, keep an eye out for the Hassan brothers, when you get gas next time. I never heard of one discussion like that anywhere. I never saw anything really on, what was then social media, message boards and things like that. So this Islamophobia thing is something that was foisted upon us. Something like, we didn't do that. We didn't think about that. We understood that there's a faction of Islam that's got some really bad guys in it. But we're not blaming everybody. We're giving them a break. We're giving them the shadow of a doubt. And so that's a lot of the reason that you didn't see a more visible reaction from the comic book companies or entertainment as a whole. I think the movies True Lies and Executive Decision are like the last time we saw Islamofascists as straight up bad guys. The Islamic terrorists as straight up bad guys. So even when Hollywood would adapt a novel or whatever that would where the bad guys were Muslim terrorists, they would invariably change it to Russians or white supremacists. Those white supremacist militias that are hiding behind every tree in the park. And that's where we were. Everybody afraid to look the enemy in the eye, to call out what was going on. We eventually elected a president with a Muslim name, who arguably was still a Muslim. So, we went that far to show, hey, we don't hate all Muslims. We heard a guy's middle name was Hussein, for God's sakes. So, that's not who we are as Americans. Just instantly started. This isn't World War II where the government is encouraging you to hate the Japanese. Notice they didn't in World War II, they didn't encourage you to hate the Germans. They made a distinction between Nazis and Germans, but for the Japanese, no. So, anyhow, well, the only comic book company that attempted anything like a response to 9/11 was CrossGen, and we created a comic book called American Power. It was going to be our first superhero title, and it was going to be about a bunch of scientifically created, genetically altered people who have become super soldiers, basically Captain America. So they were going to become super soldiers, and they were going to go right after Islamic terrorism and defending the United States of America from attack. And it was part, big like superhero war story, part espionage, and it was me wrote it, and Greg Land. I wrote 2 issues, and it was and who thought of it? It was the brainchild of one of our marketing guys, who probably doesn't want me to name him. It was brainchild of one of our marketing guys who was as liberal can be. Another guy who I really liked, he's a friend, and we liked each other, and we had a lot in common, and not politics. We didn't agree on anything. But he saw from a marketing standpoint, this would draw attention to CrossGen, which it did. And CrossGen, if you remember CrossGen at all, every first issue of a new series was 32 pages long. We gave you some real meat to hang on to, really get you into the story. And we weren't going to sell it retail. We were going to give it away at Free Comic Book Day. A genuine first issue, 32 pages of story and art given away at Free Comic Book Day. And dirty little secret, you can actually make money off of books on Free Comic Book Day, because the retailers have to buy them. They have to buy them at an extraordinarily discounted price, but they still have to pay for them. So we got orders for almost 300,000 of these things. It was going to be by far the biggest selling thing we'd ever done. And it was going to be handed out to people. So we were going to reach a really, really large audience with our first issue, and hopefully, half of them at least would come back, or a quarter of them even would have been great, come back for the following issue and stick with the series. So this was going to be our biggest hit. Now, there was controversy. One of our staff writers quit over this. He left the company. And then more and more controversy. We got pushback from Diamond. What was then the comic book media news on the internet was in its infancy, but it exploded with condemnation of this, and we were just getting lots and lots of trolling, condemning this whole idea as hateful and awful and everything else. And Mark Alessi would kind of surprise me because he is such a bulldog. He gave into it, and he canceled the project. He said, "No, okay, we're not going to do it. This is too hot." And the marketing guy and I argued that's precisely why we need to do it, because it's so hot. There's so much controversy. Everybody is talking about this frickin' book. We need to do this for the reason that so many people don't like it, that we've triggered people. But obviously, not everybody's triggered because the orders were huge. And but Mark backed down. And it's a book that potentially could have saved us, could have saved the company. But we backed down from it, which is a shame. So, that's where we stand. I think I've explained why we did this. Now, I just continue to not shy away from this subject. My Levon Cade novels deal with, particularly the book Levon's War, deals with Islamic terrorism. And one of my new books at Rippaverse, The Horseman, he is a veteran of the War on Terror. and we have flashback scenes of him in the fighting and everything else. So I continue to not shy away from this because I think it's cathartic. Now now we've seen movies about Iraq, about Afghanistan, and everything else, but not really about going after the fundamentalists, the evil people that are a part of Islam. More questions. First name, last name. This is another long one. When it comes to researching how to write about other cultures, it seems as though the internet can have quite a few skewed explanations written by heavy-handed political correctness people that, at best, will place overbearing limits on you, and at worst might wind up in all their overcompensating, telling you that you have to include things that are actually point to offensive stereotypes. I believe you previously spoke about some time you spent writing a comic for publishers in India, and you were able to research what would actually be offensive to them and avoid putting it in your script. With all that said, I have 2 questions for you. How did you do your research in a way that got you the accurate cultural knowledge about what was and was not okay to include in the script without getting misleading information from a politically correct source? What sources did you use for this and other projects where you wrote about other cultures? Do you have any recommendations for accurate sources, whether they be online, in print, or ways to politely inquire in person, for us in the audience to know what actually is and isn't offensive when writing other cultures? I did a book, Graham Nolan and I did a project for Graphics India called Black Tiger, and it was a superhero set in New Delhi, I think. And, it was Indian publishers, and more importantly, it was for an Indian audience. And I pretty much directly said, look, what do you find offensive? What do I not include? I don't know enough about India to know what not to include. And they told me, they gave me a list of things that are common stereotypes to avoid. And they appreciated that. It's not impolite to ask that. What bugs you when you see it in entertainment? If you're Mexican and everything you see they're all wearing sombreros, you're like, well, that's not right. And I didn't think that was enough because I wanted to know not only what was offensive, and I wanted to, capture their culture in comic book form. I mean, I couldn't by any means say that I was an expert in Indian culture, but I could certainly learn enough to do a superhero story set in that world. And so I watched a lot of Bollywood movies. And what Bollywood movies taught me, they're full of stereotypes, but they're full of stereotypes that Indians are fine with, obviously. This is an enormous movie audience. 1.5 billion people go to see Bollywood movies. But largely I watch them because I'm like, well, I'm writing this for an Indian audience. How is an Indian audience different than an American audience? Because they have their own, they're not just watching American movies. They are making their own movies. They have a very vital, active film community. I mean, they have their own Hollywood, Bollywood. And so they must have, they're creating entertainment for themselves. So there must be something in those movies they prefer over movies from other parts of the world because they've created their own unique entertainment. So I watched dozens and dozens of Bollywood movies, and it was like fascinating. First of all, highly entertaining. Nobody works harder to entertain you than Bollywood filmmakers. They do not want you to be bored for a second, even though so many of their movies are like almost 3 hours long. But I learned a lot of what they expected from a story, and it's largely the same as what we expect from a story, but there were some things they didn't like that we accept all the time as parts of stories. And I don't mean anything scandalous or anything like that, but just certain story elements that are perfectly acceptable into Western entertainment that they didn't either didn't get, didn't enjoy, found tedious, or whatever. And so we learned, what do they expect? And really what they expected from me was in-your-face entertainment all the time. Just boom, 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 boom. And the thing is, the only mistake I made in writing it, because I said, look, at this point, I can't learn everything. I was very open with them. And I said, I don't want to offend anybody. And I don't want to pretend that I know all about India now. I'm cool. Let me just write this. I said, look, I'm going to write it. And if I make a mistake, you correct me. And I'm all about flexibility. I'm all about the rewrite if I get something wrong. And the only thing I got wrong was I had young Indian boys playing soccer. Because we're Americans and we assume that everyone in the world loves soccer but us. So no matter where you go, you could visit a cannibal village in Papua New Guinea and they're playing soccer. And the folks at Graphics India said, soccer is really not that big a thing here. I said, well, what is? And they said, cricket. That surprised me. That really surprised me. And the more I looked into Indian culture and everything else, because I did some reading as well, there's so many holdovers from the Raj, from the British Empire, cricket being one of them, the way their military is run. There are still military regiments in the Indian Army that were begun by the English, but they're proud regiments with long history of valor and the rest of it, and they are still a part of the Indian Army. They are still named for the British generals who commanded them, back in the day. So there were a lot of holdovers from British culture, which that was fine to include them as well. But overall, if I'm introduced to if I want to go to a new place, fictionally, send my characters to someplace, how do I learn about it? YouTube videos made by tourists, and there are tourists who are professional tourists. They travel the world living off of their YouTube videos. And some of them are very good, and some of them are very dopey, as everything is on YouTube. But I watched a whole bunch of them, particularly not for the Indian thing, but for when I sent Levon Cade to Vietnam, to current day Vietnam. I watched a whole bunch of tourist videos, in addition to reading and all the rest of it. And I know Vietnamese people, so I knew some of the attitude. I'll get into that in a minute. Not particularly about Vietnamese people, but people in general. So I would watch, and it would give you an idea of what things looked like. What's the day to day in the city, at least from a tourist point of view. And then, of course, Google Maps. I wrote something recently set in Bangkok, and don't know anything about Bangkok. And the requirement was that there be car chases and action, and I needed places for these things to happen. And Google Maps was terrific. When I did Levon's War, which I mentioned recently, I mentioned a few minutes ago, I sent Levon Cade to Iraq, and I relied on Google Maps to basically let me drive the roads in the story. I could see what the buildings look like, relatively recent to when my story was set. So that's indispensable. You can learn a lot from that. We've all done this. You go there and you get the street level view and you drive, quote unquote, drive around a while anywhere in the world. And it's interesting. I was able to be so accurate with the Levon Cade story that I had a couple of guys who served in Iraq who said, yeah, I remember that. I remember that place. I remember that road. So pretty cool. Pretty cool what you can do just sitting here with your keyboard and your screen. Now, how do you write about different people? I take a very simple approach. People really aren't that different the world over. And what unites us is what we want. And most people want the same things. They want comfort. They want clean water. They want a regular meal. And if they can get all those things, they want a nice house to live in. And generally, for, not so much in America anymore, but in the rest of the world, they want to get married, raise kids, and have their children do better than they have, better than they've done. You want your children to succeed. That's the American dream, but really that's the human dream. There isn't anybody on the whole planet that doesn't want their kids to do better than they've done. So that unites us, and it's like any other character. The most important thing is what that character wants. And Batman wants to do well by his parents. Superman wants to be, part of the human race. Luke Skywalker wants to join the rebellion and succeed. Darth Vader wants his son to come into the family business. So it's all what drives, Galactus wants to eat the planet, Silver Surfer wants to save it. It's all about what a character wants. That's what drives a story forward. That's what drives our lives forward. Think about it. When you get up in the morning, what are you doing? You're pursuing what you want, even if it's just breakfast. Why get out of bed? Maybe you're going to a job you hate, but you're pursuing it, for whatever reason. You've got some sort of ultimate goal in mind. So bottom line, we are all the same. We are united, no matter what our religion or background or what our culture tells us. We are united by that as people, not as governments. Governments have differences with each other all the time, but that's not people. Whether you live in a communist regime or a democracy or a hippie commune, you generally want the same thing. Now, there are people who don't want the same thing. They don't necessarily want their children to do better than they did. They don't necessarily want to be happy and secure. And these are bad people. That's where you mine for your villains. So there are people that are unlike that. And this is why they stick out in society. This is why we should not tolerate them. Because they're not down with the rest of us. They're not all about leaving us alone to pursue our own desires and wants. So there you go. Thus endeth the lesson. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Thanks for subscribing and liking. And thanks for the terrific questions. You people are, you humble me. This simple little show where I'm answering questions about writing comic books, and you ask these like probing questions that I, do my best to rise to the occasion. All I can do is give you my opinion and the the value of my experience. So anyway, enough of that. I'll see you all down the road.